In the evening of Thursday, the 5th of December 2013, President Jacob Zuma of South Africa announced the news of Nelson Mandela's death. Although Mandela had been ill for a long time and was 95 when he died, the world was in shock. It was difficult to imagine life without the man who had faced violence, brutality, and many years in prison as part of his struggle to make South Africa a better place. When Nelson Mandela was born on the 18th of July 1918 in a small South African village, his father gave him the name Rolihlahla, which means troublemaker, in his tribal asterisk language. As a young boy, Mandela made a catapult and hit birds out of the sky. He learned how to stick fight with other boys, and later he became interested in boxing. This troublemaker would have a huge positive impact on human rights. Around the world, Mandela's father had 4 wives and 13 children. Mandela was lucky. He was the first child in his family to go to school. At school, Mandela's teacher gave him the name Nelson. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela explains that white people believed it was more civilized to have a European name. Apart from that, most white people could not pronounce African names. It was a tradition in Mandela's tribe for boys to be circumcised dollar in their teenage years. The operation was very painful, but it was a custom that changed a boy into a man. Mandela was 16 when he had the operation, and he felt very scared, but he suffered the pain in silence. In his autobiography, Mandela says, "A boy may cry. A man hides his pain." Mandela didn't know it then, but he would suffer many more painful experiences in the future. Mandela was growing up at a time when white people had almost total control in South Africa. But as a young village boy, he was not yet aware of this power. However, in 1939, Mandela went to study at the University College of Fort Hare, a university for black students, and he began to realize that South African society was not fair. When Mandela helped students to protest about poor quality food at the university in 1940, for example, he was forced to leave. In 1943, Mandela went to study law at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. It was there that he met Evelyn Mace, a trainee nurse. They fell in love and married in 1944. At the same time, Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, the party that was fighting for black people's rights and for equality between blacks and whites. In 1948, while Nelson Mandela was living in Johannesburg and working as a lawyer, the government started to introduce the system of apartheid. This meant that everything was officially separated, including schools, hospitals, beaches, toilets, buses, and even public benches. People who did not obey the law were often arrested. They were put in prison and could be tortured or even killed. Apartheid meant that whites now had complete power over black people. In addition, blacks were not allowed to vote in elections, and many were forced to leave their homes and move to townships in other parts of the city. Nelson Mandela became very involved with the ANC and their protests. However, he had always believed in peaceful protests, and he had never wanted to use violence. But when peaceful protests didn't work, he changed his opinion. Then, in March 1960, a crowd of people gathered outside the police station in Sharpeville near Johannesburg in a protest about rights for black people. As more protesters arrived, the police suddenly began to shoot at the crowd. They continued to shoot even when the terrified people started to run away. That day, the South African police killed 69 people and injured 180 others. Many of those who died were shot in the back. Many people who were at the scene said that the protest had been peaceful before the police shot at the crowd. Others reported that they had seen some people throw stones at the police. However, it became clear after the massacre that the protesters had not had guns. The news of the massacre spread around the world, and many countries realized that the situation in South Africa could no longer be ignored. After the Sharpeville massacre, Mandela started an ANC military group. He visited different countries to get money to support and train the group. The military group's aim circumflex was to distrove a number of government buildings, but not to kill people. Mandela was arrested for sabotage in 1963, and in the following year he was sent to prison for life on Robben Island, near Cape Town. The years in prison were long and very hard. Mandela's marriage to Evelyn had ended in divorce in 1958. In the same year, he had married Winifred, or Winnie, Madikizela. Mandela missed Winnie very much when he was in prison, and at first he was only allowed to write 2 letters a year to his family and friends. Later, he could write 2 letters a month. One of the worst moments was when his oldest son, Madiba, was killed in a car crash in 1969. Madiba had promised to look after the family while his father was in prison. Mandela was not allowed to go to the funeral. However, Mandela never stopped fighting, even when he was in prison. He organized a hunger strike and found clever ways to send important news around the prison. When Mandela was sent to prison, many people in the ANC had thought that change would come very soon. This didn't happen, and in the 1980s there were more bombings by the ANC's military group. This time, people were killed in the attacks. In 1985, the South African government offered Mandela his freedom if he stopped the ANC violence and promised not to speak about apartheid after his release. He refused to do so. Mandela's fight became well known in countries all around the world, and this put a lot of pressure on the government to end apartheid. Mandela was in prison for almost 27 years. Finally, in 1990, President F.W. de Klerk released Mandela without any conditions. Many white South Africans had been afraid that they would lose their land and that they would have to leave the country if apartheid ended. But Nelson Mandela realized that hatred would never heal the country. He agreed to work with de Klerk to end apartheid peacefully. In 1993, they both won the Nobel Peace Prize for their determination and hard work. Mandela and de Klerk continued to cooperate, and in 1994, South Africa held its first free elections. It was then that the troublemaker, Rolihlahla Mandela, became the first black African president of South Africa. In 1996, Mandela divorced Winnie Mandela. He married his third wife, Graça Machel, on his 80th birthday in 1998. A year later, he retired as the President of South Africa, but Mandela did not retire from public life. He continued to work for peace in other African countries and around the world. As he grew older, his most important work became his fight against the disease AIDS. When his son Magatho died in 2005, Mandela announced to the world that Magatho had died of AIDS. This shocked people in Africa, who until then had refused to talk about the disease and tried to hide it. In a speech, Mandela said, "Let us give publicity to AIDS and not hide it, because the only way to make it appear like a normal illness, like TB, like cancer, is always to come out and to say somebody has died because of AIDS. And people will stop regarding it as something extraordinary." In 2003, Mandela started a charity named after his Robben Island prison number, 46664, that raised money through international pop concerts for AIDS victims. Many famous pop groups and musicians played concerts for the charity around the world between 2003 and 2008. Mandela also supported many other charities that work for AIDS awareness and the victims of the disease. Nelson Mandela overcame huge challenges during his life and had many successes in his struggle for peace, equality, and justices in South Africa and the world. And Mandela's dream is still alive today. His grandson, Luvuyo Mandela, said, "We are all citizens of the world, and as citizens it is our duty to help change it for the better."